Welcome to Lesson 3 of Logic Made Accessible. Last week we learned about terms, and this week we're learning about the second building block of logic, propositions. A proposition is whatever a declarative sentence expresses, in such a way that it can either be true or false. Let's unpack this. From the perspective of Aristotelian logic, propositions take a specific form. First a subject, followed by a copula, which introduces the predicate. Like in the sentence, Aristotle is mortal. What's the difference between a proposition and a sentence? The declarative sentence is Aristotle is mortal, while the proposition is the very idea that Aristotle is mortal. To clarify, two different declarative sentences can express the same proposition. Aristotle is mortal and Aristotle is a thing that will die are different declarative sentences, but they both express the idea that Aristotle is mortal. This distinction is important because propositions are what we care about when evaluating the truth of a declarative sentence. Unlike terms, propositions can either be true or false, and they are always one of the two. We call these truth values. In other words, a proposition can have one of the two truth values, true or false. Further still, it must be either true or false. How do we figure out if a proposition is true or false? In Aristotelian logic, we say that a proposition is true if and only if it actually corresponds to the facts of the matter that it describes. For example, Aristotle is mortal is true if and only if it is actually the case that Aristotle is mortal. If we got into the world, check and see if Aristotle is mortal, and discover that he actually is, then Aristotle is mortal is true. When we do this quote-unquote checking, we say that we are evaluating the proposition. Sometimes instead of checking, we're instead interested to see what we can deduce from a proposition if it is true or if it is false. We suppose that it's true or false and see where that can lead us. In such cases, we say that we assign a truth value to a proposition. We can think, what follows if America lost the Revolutionary War is true, or what follows if all men are mortal is false. The connection hinted at in the previous example turns out to be really important in logic. It has to do with negation. The negation of a proposition is what we get when we take a proposition and say that whatever it expresses is not the case. For example, the negation of Aristotle is mortal is, it's not the case that Aristotle is mortal. In this case, we can achieve the same result by denying the predicate of the subject. In other words, the negation of Aristotle is mortal is Aristotle is not mortal. It is worth noting that this method of simply denying the predicate does not always yield the negation of a proposition. We will deal with this more in later lessons. Looking at our initial definition, we can see that the negation of a proposition is also a proposition itself. It's either true or false. With this in mind, it's easy to see the connection between a proposition and its negation. When the proposition has one truth value, its negation has the other one. Specifically, since Aristotle is mortal is true, it is not the case that Aristotle is mortal is false. Very importantly, the double negation of a proposition yields the same proposition. For instance, it's not the case that Aristotle is mortal. It's really just saying Aristotle is mortal. This result is very important in logic. Let's take the following proposition. Aristotle is female. This proposition will be true according to our earlier standard if and only if it is actually the case that Aristotle is female. However, Aristotle is male. Therefore, Aristotle is female is false, and its negation, Aristotle is not female, is true. It should be clear by now that the negation is a kind of switch between the two truth values. Take a true proposition and negate it, you'll get a false proposition. Take a false proposition and negate it, you'll get a true proposition. Furthermore, we can also see that whenever we take a proposition and its negation, if the first is true, the second has to be false. And if the first is false, then the second has to be true. We'll have more to say about this result at the very end of our course. At this point, you might be asking yourself about what would happen if we took a proposition in which the predicate is denied of a subject and then negated that. Look at the following. Aristotle is not female. What do you do in a sentence like this? According to our earlier explanation, the negation of this proposition would look something like this. Aristotle is not female. Or, it is not the case that Aristotle is not female. These look quite strange, but luckily we can simplify them to a more familiar expression. Take the former. We know that Aristotle is not female is true, and we know that the negation switches truth values. Therefore, we know that Aristotle is not female, the negation of Aristotle is female, is false. But we know that Aristotle is female is also false from the previous example, so that its negation is exactly Aristotle is not female. So when we say Aristotle is not female, we're just flipping back to Aristotle is female in a roundabout way. The above is an instance of the kind of reasoning we sometimes do in logic. We have some information and we leverage it to get other, hopefully clearer information. What we learned in example 4 is simply to state 2 negations get you an affirmation. In logicians talk, this is called the law of double negation. In conclusion, propositions are the things we express when we use declarative sentences. To build such assertions, we need to use terms in a particular way, a subject term, a predicate term, and a copula to put them together. Constructing propositions out of terms gets us a kind of statement that has a truth value. Evaluating truth values by checking against reality and using negation to switch truth values tells us interesting things about propositions and, in consequence, about the world. But propositions taken in isolation can only get us so far. We want to see what happens when we put propositions together, how they connect, and what further things we can learn by investigating connections between them. This will get us arguments. In the next lesson, we'll take a look at a specific form of argument that we can get by putting propositions together, namely the syllogism. This will turn out to be very important for the rest of our course. Looking forward to seeing you next time.